played football, and he served as an assistant football coach from 1973 until 2003. Assistant athletic director, and from 1992 until 2003, athletic director at UVM. He speaks and consults on hazing education and student-athlete leadership at colleges and universities throughout the United States. We're also lucky to have with us today Dave Landers. Dave is retired as a professor of psychology at St. Michael's College, but he remains the college's faculty athletic representative to the NCAA. He spent nearly 30 years at St. Michael's, and in 2014, he won a national award from the NCAA for mentoring athletes at St. Michael's. His areas of expertise include sports psychology, abnormal psychology, and theories of consulting. And finally, we have attorney Heather Thomas Lynn with us. She's a partner at the law firm Lynn, Blackman, and Manitsky. Lynn, Blackman, and Manitsky in Burlington. And one of her areas of practice is education law. She counsels school districts in Vermont colleges and universities concerning student discipline, disability issues, and special education law. And she also trains school administrators and staff on the Vermont Department of Education's model procedures related to hazing, harassment, and bullying. So thanks to our panelists for being here today, and now I'd like to turn it over to our own Professor Brian Porto.
Thank you, Beth, and let me echo Dean McCormick's welcome. This is our annual Sports Law Institute panel. Every year we look at a different issue in amateur sports. Occasionally we look at professional sports, but mostly amateur sports. And this year's panel will examine hazing and its various implications. Our discussion will likely generate questions. We certainly hope it does, and we encourage you to ask questions, but we also ask you to leave them to the end. We will leave time for them. Actually two other preliminaries. First, for my students only, and you seem to be the majority of the audience, which is perfectly fine. An attendance sheet is available at the front. Samantha has it. Samantha, stand up and take a bow. If you haven't already signed it, you can sign it on the way out. And then the second item, for anyone here who has been a victim of hazing, just please be aware that some parts of today's discussion may be disturbing, may bring back unpleasant memories. We just want to provide you with that trigger so that you're aware of that, and you should feel free to take a break if that's necessary. All right, let's begin by making sure we all mean the same thing when we refer to hazing, because it's so easy to confuse hazing with bullying and harassment. We bandy those various terms about. I'm going to call on Dave, our psychologist, to get us started. Dave, two questions. First, I learned in law school not to ask compound questions because they confuse the witness, so I'm going to ask two questions. How do you define hazing, and how do you distinguish hazing from bullying?
Great. Thank you very much, and it's nice to see so many people here, whether you have to be here or not. It's a fascinating topic, and it is a little disarming for me because this is 2018 and we're having a workshop on hazing. And the reality is that at this point in our lives, we should not have to do that. But hazing is still too prevalent, and we need to do more to educate everybody about the issues around hazing. I've been working on hazing issues for longer than most of you have been alive, and it really is disconcerting, the fact that we still have to deal with it and this still goes on. So let me try and answer the first one. For years, we weren't sure how to specifically define hazing, and now the almost universally accepted definition, and Heather has a slide later and it'll be up there on the slide. And so hazing is any act committed against someone joining or becoming a member or maintaining membership in any organization, and here are the key words, that is humiliating, intimidating, or demeaning, or endangers the health and safety of the person. Hazing includes active or passive participation in such acts and occurs regardless of the willingness to participate in the activities. One of the things that we often hear is students say, well, I don't object to that. That's irrelevant anymore. The definition now also says, regardless of the willingness to participate. Hazing creates an environment, climate in which dignity and respect are absent. So hazing is about inclusion. And it is an attempt to get someone to be part of an organization, whether that organization is a fraternity, an athletic team, a band, fire and rescue, whatever that group is. Hazing is about inclusion. So the goal is to bring people in. Bullying, on the other hand, is to separate someone and to exclude someone. So if you're bullying someone, you're trying to either deflect from yourself. So if I call you a name that's a derogatory name for being gay, for example, no one's going to think that I might be gay if I'm accusing you of being gay. And so bullying really tries to separate out people. One of the other things that's been going on the last many years, as I hope you're all aware, is the whole thing of cyberbullying. You don't see a lot about cyber hazing, but you see a lot about cyberbullying. And the consequences of the cyberbullying is really, really disturbing. So the difference between the two, hazing is about inclusion, trying to get someone to be a member of or a participant in or an active part of something, and bullying is more to exclude someone.
Thank you. Rick and Heather, if either of you want to weigh in on this topic?
Well, first I would say that I agree with that, but it's kind of funny when, whether it's fraternity brothers or athletic teams or the band, they're trying to get someone to be included in their organization, and yet they want to put them through the demeaning experience of hazing. And it just doesn't make sense. And that's what I think part of the educational process is, to determine and educate those individuals of the difference. Because I know, even in my own experience as a fraternity brother, it made me not want to be a part of the organization. So they weren't trying to include me at all. They were just sending me away because of my own value system.
Heather?
Well, and I'll just pick up on that point a bit when I am working with my clients, and my clients by and large tend to be the K through 12 school systems around the state of Vermont. And the definition that was referenced at the top really at its core contains two main components. One is the idea that hazing is an act that endangers the emotional or physical safety of a student, and also has components of humiliating, degrading, or intimidating conduct. Those from the perspective of K through 12 in the state of Vermont, actually we split those two components out. Bullying is the intimidating, degrading, humiliating behavior. And as long as it's repeated and happens on campus or during a school-sponsored activity, that is enough to satisfy a violation of bullying. For hazing, the hazing definition has been cut off of that and is reserved for those behaviors of any sort. And there's no requirement other than proof that the behavior endangers the mental or physical health of the target. So at the grade school level, when I'm doing my trainings and working with my clients and explaining what they need to impress upon the grade school students, is that a lot of hazing, capital H, behaviors that we might be alert to may actually technically satisfy the bullying definitions under our school policies. But all of these types of behaviors are indeed prohibited by both Vermont law and the Student Code of Conduct. But for better or for worse, a lot of us get very attached to which label are we dealing with. And I'm always working with my clients and indeed encouraging them to work with their students to have sort of a broad tent, which is these are all behaviors which are going to get in the way of either safety of students at school or the ability of a student to be able to come to school and access their education. And these are the varieties and ways in which we have defined them so that we can seek them out, eradicate them.
Can I add one quick point?
Sure.
In Dave's definition, and it's basically a lot of what we use in athletics, there are a couple of points that I think are critical. One is passive and active participation. You go as part of a group and you say, I didn't do anything, I was just there. Right. Did you know what was going on? Yeah, I watched it. Well, you're just as much a perpetrator if you don't try to do something as those that are getting their pledges or whatever it is, newcomers involved in activities. And the other important part is the willingness to participate in the environment or the climate that is permeating or perpetrating the hazing incidents is just as significant, in my opinion. You create an environment where everyone's not accepted and their dignity is not adhered to, you've got a hazing problem. Right. And I think that's important.
And one of the things that's concerned me, the definition that I gave is the one that the NCAA puts out. But I attend, as the faculty athletics rep for St. Mike's, I attend the NCAA National Convention every year, and I have for 13 years. The last time that the NCAA presented a workshop at the National Convention was in 2008. And there's a document that Rick wrote, basically, and it's called Building New Traditions, Hazing Prevention in College Athletics. This came out in 2007, but they don't talk about it at the convention. They talk about a lot of other things, but they don't have workshops on this. Now, last week, the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators had their national convention. They had 5 workshops on hazing. In 2018, they had 5 workshops. The NCAA hasn't touched this. So I got in touch with a friend of mine, mutual friend that we have, Mary Wilford, the other day in preparation for this, and I said, when are you going to come out with something new? Because everything we have is back in 2007, 2008. And she said they've turned most of this information over to the people who run the Apple Conference. Now, the Apple Conference brings about 75 student athletes from around the country together to talk about issues around sports and athletics. But she also said that there's going to be a new thing coming out in spring of 2018, which I think is right now, and it's called the NCAA Sports Science Institute, in partnership with the Institute to promote Athlete Health and Wellness, presents My Playbook, the Freshman Experience, which is going to be an online thing. One of the issues that comes out, supposedly spring of 2018, is hazing prevention. But up to this point, there's very little conversation about this, which I find really disturbing.
Let me turn back to Rick. You've certainly had considerable experience with hazing as a college athletic director and as a hazing educator and consultant. I'm wondering, now that we have a clearer idea of what we're talking about with regard to hazing, what it means, why do you think this persists despite our efforts to eliminate it?
Well, from my experience in sitting down and thinking about, well, why does this happen? And you can't come up and say, well, it's human nature. But I know this. When you grow up in a family like I did of 4 boys, you know that the nonsense goes on all the time. You pay your brother a nickel to eat the onions that you don't like, until he gets sick. And, that's funny. And it's part of character, but there's 4 concepts that I put together in terms of why does it happen. The first is cultural. It's a pervasive behavior in our culture that says to individuals, well, you got to prove yourself to me if you want to be socially acceptable. And it's a cultural kind of thing that makes it difficult to eradicate. And it's gained acceptance by some students because they just think it's something that will bond them together as a part of a fraternity, a team, the band, and yet they don't care about the consequences. They don't think about the consequences. And we probably hear about the tip of the iceberg in terms of hazing events, because that's where something went wrong. Something went wrong, someone filed a lawsuit, and 90% of probably what goes on, you never hear about. So we need to teach people to be able to stand up, have the courage to talk about the things that are going on. But human nature, and I saw it in my family with 4 boys, it's fun to humiliate your younger brother just because it's funny. And too many students think that that's an okay kind of thing. So you get cultural, and then you've got group mentality. And group mentality, I talked to someone the other day and I said, I had to throw a bank president out of his hockey seats because he was obnoxious at the game. And all the people around him wanted to change their seats, but I couldn't do it. and he wouldn't change his behavior, so we had to take away his seats. A bank president. Now, he doesn't behave like that when he's in the bank or working or whatever, but he's in a game. He's in a group mentality. So he thinks it's a license to get all over the refs or what have you. And that's what happens amongst teams. They think you have to, it accomplishes team building. It instills a humility in new athletes or newcomers to the organization. It establishes a hierarchy for making decisions. And they believe that it's the free choice of most of the students to participate. But it's not free choice. You want to be socially accepted, you go along with what happens. And here's the major misunderstanding. Now it's the individual. This is the third of the, you got culture, you got group behavior, and then the individuality is that most victims believe that the consequences of what they're asked to do are far less than the consequences of not being socially accepted. And so they go along with it. And it's called a moral, a degrading of their morals. They'll accept these behaviors in that consequential situation where they won't if it was a normal life experience. So they abandon their beliefs and their morals, and they go along with it. Then the last thing that I'd have to say in this is that I'll take my culture of athletics. And you know, if you want to be the shortstop, you got to be able to field the ball, make the throw, cover the deep hole, do all the things skillfully. And a coach has tryouts. And what does a coach do? He puts the best individual in that position. And it becomes clear to all the other students and players on that team that that's our number one shortstop or third baseman or whatever it is, pitcher, catcher, whatever position in any sport. And so the older athletes see that everybody has to prove themselves physically, skillfully, knowledgeable. And so it's okay then for them to take the concept, you want to be part of this team socially? You prove it to us by showing us that you're willing to sacrifice your values and do stupid things and humiliating things. You do it and prove to us that you're willing to do this to become acceptable. And those consequences that an individual thinks are not going to harm them, it's a false sense. I'll show you a little later what we use for our athletes for discussion, and it's called hazing or whatever, the misunderstandings and the truths. So anyway, those are those 4 points.
Thank you. Heather, you want to weigh in on this? Why it persists?
Well, in my experience, and again, I'm dealing typically with younger students, but in high schools, what I have found, and I'll give an example, is a case where we were doing a training, my clients were, I was not present, for the student body at the start of the school year, explaining what the rules are and explaining what hazing was. And there was then a break, and a student approached one of the teachers on the side of the conference room and said, I actually think this happened to me last year in one of the seasons, and went on to describe some behaviors which would indeed, if true, constitute hazing. Client called me with first one question, which is, okay, so it happened last year, are we supposed to do something about it now? And I said, well, if the perpetrator is one of your students and you still have jurisdiction over them, yeah, you need to look into that from that perspective. And if they had gone on to graduate and go somewhere else, we would still have some work to do. So they did the investigation, and what came back was that some students had been asked to engage in a behavior, and they had said no, and others did. And they brought those results back to me, and they said, so what does this all mean? I said, well, I want you to go back and talk to the kids who refused. And I want you to ask them why. I want to understand better what was operating to allow them to say the no. And then I want you to press and say, why did the no not then convert into, I'm going to tell somebody about it? Because what you're telling me with that kind of evidence is that at some level, the kids who said no decided this violated some code of ethic for them, either their personal values, their family values. They felt like that was a transgression they were not willing to engage in. But they didn't make the connection that by doing so, I am letting down the team values, I am letting down the school expectations, and I am transgressing against the school as a community. And that is where your work needs to happen going forward at the end of this investigation. Aligning the school, the community, and the team all on the side of these are our values, and they are expressed at various points in times, but it is immovable. This isn't an interpersonal dispute. When you engage in this behavior, you are violating the code of conduct for the community. And so I am standing up for the community, not some individual-based issue. And I think that when you shift the narrative that way and you align your organization that way, I think you have more success.
And let me ask you a question. How many of you have seen the documentary that was put out by the fraternity members of SUNY Plattsburgh called Unless a Death Occurs? Have any of you seen it? You should go online and watch this.
Is this the student who died after?
This is a student who died, and what happened, it was a fraternity. It wasn't a sports team, but it was a fraternity, and this young man was from California, wanted to belong to the fraternity. He had an exam the next day, and he said, I can't participate in this activity, which involved alcohol, because I have an exam tomorrow. And so they said, all right, you're gonna drink water. So they had him drink water, gallons and gallons and gallons of water, and all the systems in his body shut down and he died. Now, those young men in that fraternity didn't want him to die. They didn't want him to be hurt. They said, okay, you've got an exam. You're not gonna have to do that. Just drink water. And so the judge, whoever the judge was, very smart, because the fraternity brothers were brought up to trial, he made them do a public service announcement, and it's a documentary which I've shown in my sports psychology class many times. And again, if you haven't seen it, you really need to. It's called Unless a Death Occurs. And as Rick made reference to, these young people don't think someone's gonna die from what I'm doing. And yet this young man died. And so that documentary is really, really powerful, and the individual impact that it happens. I had a young man, I was a counselor in the public schools of Pontiac, Michigan for 16 years in a high school before I came to St. Mike's. And for 24 years, I was head of the counseling center. I had a young man who came to see me who was having a drinking problem. He came to see me because his parents made him. As a freshman, he joined our soccer team. He refused to participate in hazing and was ostracized by his friends, by his roommates, by the other men on the soccer team. And while he felt good about himself because he refused to put up with hazing, his buddies weren't refusing. They were all doing that. And how did he deal with that? He turned to alcohol. And we're going to talk more about the impact on the individual and society in a few minutes. But that's some of the stuff you have to think about, is what goes into someone's mindset when they're put in a situation where they're not physically forced to participate in hazing, but there's social construction. Or there's another thing we've been talking about for maybe 6-8 years. It's called athlete identity. If you're an athlete, you started playing your sport at 3 or 4 years of age. Your reinforcement for almost everything you've done up until the time you graduate from undergraduate college has been connected to your sport. Your whole identity. Had a young man who's a hockey player. I'm Alex, I play hockey. But a young woman who played basketball since she was 3. Spent time with her dad playing basketball. Went to high school, wanted to go to a Division I school. Wasn't good enough. Got into St. Mike's. Played for 4 years, did fine. She's now working with our women's basketball team on some of these issues. But when she graduated, she was devastated because her sense of who she was totally wrapped up in her ability to play basketball, and all of a sudden, that was over. And she looked around, she said, what do I have? She ended up doing her master's thesis, and I was an advisor for that, on athlete identity. So in order to make that decision, I'm not going to participate in this, that means I'm giving up a lot. And some people don't have the strength to do that.
I'm going to deviate. I don't usually do this, but I'm going to deviate just a little bit from the script to ask a question that has come into my mind while we've been talking, and that is, again, I'll start with Rick, and then we'll head down the panel. Do you see, when you see hazing occur, does it seem like it occurs in certain sports more than others, or does it cover the gamut of sports?
I think it covers the gamut of every program going on. Yeah. What happens is too many coaches, too many administrators are naive to think nothing like that happens on their campus or on their team. But I will tell you, something like that goes on every team, every situation in America. But it's underground. You're not going to see it. You're not going to hear about it. Nobody's going to talk about it. But if you asked every team, and maybe the teams that you participated in, what's one of the first things that happened when you got to campus? The upperclassmen told you, hey, we got a party next Saturday at our apartment. Come on down. You're all welcome as new players. And you get down there, you're 18 years old, you've never drank in your life, and the next thing you know, you're in a drinking game. So, and what I've seen, and I've gone to softball teams, to women's gymnastic teams, to women's swimming teams, I don't see it any different from men or women. It runs the gamut of all sports programs, and it can get just as violent and just as physical with either one, or, humiliating.
Yeah. And I have to agree with Rick, and some data that came out from the Sports Science Institute of the NCAA, 74% of student athletes experience at least one form of hazing while in college. 74%. The most frequently reported hazing behavior among student athletes is participating in drinking games. That was 47%. 23% of student athletes reported having to drink large amounts of alcohol to the point of getting sick or passing out as part of a hazing activity. And we tend to think about hazing in sports and athletics because they get the most publicity. But it's happening in band, we have a fire and rescue program at St. Mike's. One night they had to take one of their new pledges to the hospital because he drank too much. This is the fire and rescue group, and their job is to save people's lives. Their initiation, they ended up having to take someone to the hospital because of this. The other thing is, nearly half of college students, 47%, were hazed in high school. They come to college with the expectation, I'm going to be hazed. And they see that as a rite of passage, as opposed to Hank Newer's book, The Wrongs of Passage.
Here's a very quick point. I've seen it as high as 85% when the Alfred University did their initial studies. Yep. But if it's 74% have indicated they've been hazed or seen hazing, guess what? Yeah. Less than probably 10% report it or have a problem with it or tell anybody about it. And that's why it's such a problem. It's that group mentality that, hey, nobody complains, so it must be okay, so I'll go along with it.
And it doesn't make any difference what the athletic director says, or the coach, or the legal advisor, the counselor, or the professor. It doesn't make any difference what we say, because they have a mind of their own, and they come in with the expectation, hazing is part of my college experience, I want that to happen. And unless a death occurs, they're probably going to get away with it.
Let's let Heather
one last quick
get in
thing.
here.
Yeah. What our job is to teach them to step up.
Yes.
Have the courage to step up.
I would just echo I think it's the Alfred University study is a study that I use often in my trainings, and I use it to point out that it's not just athletic groups. It can be the chess club. In fact, I think it's a 35% of students who said they were hazed had been hazed in church groups. And so I always point that out to say, look, it's about the group relationship. It's not necessarily the nature of the group. It's not, oh, they're rowdy football players, so they're prone to more violence. It's how do we bond together as a group? And I also think it's important to do the work in the middle school and the high school when students start trying out for and gaining admission to select groups of teams. We have to then step in and model for them what are pro-social, what are appropriate group bonding activities, what does it mean to be a member of our team, how do you live the values of our team. What I tell my clients is the students that go off to college and get hazed in the fall or in the spring and end up almost dying, those are our failures. Any school they came from as a high school, that is our failure because we didn't arm those kids with the skills necessary to succeed in college, which needs to include saying, not for me, this isn't what being a member of this team means. How we do that at the elementary, middle, and high school level has to be married with, hey, recognizing that students are perhaps more easily led, so we have to give them another viewpoint, which is, there's a huge downside to this. If we hear that you're engaging in this, your membership on the team is a privilege, not a right. So the fact that my clients have to get through an investigation with due process before they can suspend or expel a child from school does not attach to membership on teams. We're going to take you off the team immediately, bar you from team activities immediately, and all home and away games you cannot go to. And I don't care if you're the best scorer on the team.
Shouldn't matter.
We have to provide the disincentive and make it real so that they know that there is a consequence to doing this.
And I taught a course called Men and Masculinities. It was the only course at St. Mike's that talked about men's issues. It was also the only course at St. Mike's that had a balance of men and women. I had 15 men and 15 women, all second semester seniors, one night a week for 3.5 hours. It was unbelievable.
I bet it was fast.
And when we talk about hazing, there have been some strides made by many teams. Most of the ones who've made a change and a difference, who have done other things besides hazing, where they've gotten together to go and paint someone's house or to do landscaping, have been our women's teams. The men's teams are so far behind our women's teams in their ability to recognize that hazing is a destructive activity, and so many of the women's teams have changed what they've done.
You really do need to replace. You can't just say no. You have to say, this is how we live our values. Maybe we'll choose a nonprofit organization that we're going to direct our extra efforts on behalf of them as a team. We're going to play for them, and we're going to live for them and do for them. But you can't just say, don't do these things. We have to say, and these are the way you will bond, but in a positive way.
All right, I'd like to turn now to Dave and then to Heather to address the effects of hazing on individuals and institutions, respectively. Dave, why don't you address effects on individuals, and then Heather can talk about effects on institutions, particularly schools that she works with.
And this is, when I'm doing a workshop or a presentation on hazing, this is the part that gets most people really, really, really uncomfortable. So if you get uncomfortable, you're not unusual. So when you think about the individual, so think about this for a second. There's a young woman, 14 years old. She wanted to be part of a gymnastics team. And the initiation was that she had to go to this one area one night, and the students were around in a circle, and there was a guy there, and he had a banana sticking out of the front of his pants, and she had to eat the banana. She was 14 years old. I don't know Lizzie Murdy's background. I don't know what happened to her. But what do you think the psychological damage would be to this young woman if she had been sexually assaulted, or she had been made to have oral sex with someone before she tried out for the gymnastics team? What do you think the damage would be to her, psychologically? And the second one is, there was a Boston Bruins hockey player named Sheldon Kennedy. Sheldon Kennedy came from a small town in Canada. He was very good. Didn't like where he was living. It was a difficult situation, but he was a good hockey player. And his coach said to his family, come and live with me. So he did. The coach was going to set him up, do all kinds of stuff. First night he's there, the coach climbs into bed with him. He tries to push the coach away. The coach gets up out of bed, opens up the closet door, turns the light on, there's a gun there. Turned the light off, got back in bed. Sheldon Kennedy was sexually abused by that coach for years. He then ended up being a member of the Boston Bruins. He was married, drinking a lot. And he finally saw this guy who was the coach with young men. And he knew that the guy was probably continuing to do it, which he was. And so he went public. What do you think the psychological impact would have been on Sheldon Kennedy if he'd gone to a college where, as part of the initiation, he had to participate in what they call the elephant walk, where they're naked and they have to walk from point A to point B, holding the penis of the guy behind them while the person in front of them held their penis. So someone who had been sexually abused, whether it was Lizzie Murdy or it was Sheldon Kennedy, are put into a sexualized situation. And I've asked this question and no one's given me an answer. Why is it that so much of hazing is sexualized? Both men and women. It's sexualized. Why? And what is the psychological impact on these people? See, when someone arrives on my campus, if they're an athlete, I know how many games they participated in. I know all about their sport. I know what their records are. I know what they did in high school. I know what they could do in college. I know all of the stuff that I need to know about who they are as an athlete. I don't know if they've been sexually abused. I don't know what their family environment was. But if they come to my school and they end up on a team that hazes, and they're put into a situation where that replicates something that happened to them, psychologically, that's devastating. Now, the other thing is when they arrive on my campus, all they want to do is belong. They want to fit in, and they're willing to put up with anything. But think about, and most of you hopefully have taken at least one psychology course, think about the psychological impact on players who arrive on a college campus when we don't know anything about their history, and yet we take them in as part of our community, and then because we don't stop the hazing, we inflict more psychological trauma on all those folks. That's the impact on the individual. My niece was born in Korea. I loved Maggie dearly. She was the only freshman in Wilton, Connecticut on the girls' swim team. She was also the only one who had a little darker pigment to her skin. She's hazed in the cafeteria in front of faculty, administrators, other people. They wrote the word shit across her forehead and hazed her. She didn't say anything to anybody. A couple weeks later at the end of the year banquet, a mother said to my sister, "I'm so sorry about what happened to Maggie." And my sister said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Well, the hazing thing." My sister knew nothing about it. The woman explained to her what had happened. My sister talked to Maggie, and Maggie goes, Mom, you can't say anything. You can't say anything because those girls will make it worse for me, make it worse than what it already is. And she was a freshman in high school. What was the impact on her? She never swam again. She never swam again. That's the impact on an individual when they're put into a hazing situation, and we as the adults in the room don't protect them. Heather?
Well, just picking up on that last thought about the student who never swam again and was so reluctant to have anything said or done, that is a textbook example of retaliation. And so the fourth piece of what I train on, there's hazing, there's harassment, there's bullying, which are all just legal terms for all the kinds of behaviors we've been talking about. But then I talk about retaliation and how the institution, the school, has to affirm and reaffirm both before a student comes forward and then most crucially when they do, to provide protection for that student so that, as I like to say, the cure isn't worse than the disease. A kid will put up with a lot of bullying or hazing or harassment, but it's the fallout from their peers that they suffer from when it goes public. And of course, by and large, it shouldn't be public because it's a confidential process in the 0 to 18 age group, but nevertheless, it gets around. And so explaining to the faculty that we need to not wait until an investigation is launched to then scratch our head and say, and how will we provide those protections? Rather, we need to triage in advance and come up with strategies that we are ready to click into place. It's not a wonderful example, but the one that's most recent to me is a hazing case that we had, which did result in a student being immediately taken off the team while both law enforcement and the school internally did its work. We knew that it would get out and students would have opinions and voice those opinions towards the victim. And the faculty was on alert, so that the first time that happened, it wasn't even fully out of that student's mouth that the faculty swept in and said, I need to have a conversation with you. Went down the hall into the office and said, what did you just say? Well, I just think it's ridiculous that our team doesn't have their best player or scorer or whatever, or goalie, because, okay, right there, that's retaliation. You are on notice, you engage it in again, you will be suspended. Go tell your friends this will not happen again. Is there anything we don't understand? But again, the institution has to think about and not be on its heels, and then live it and tell kids again and again and again. And I feel that if we in the middle school and the high school can arm students with those experiences, they arrive in college ready for the next piece, which is we're not going to engage in the illegal activities and the drinking games. But it needs to be a partnership.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rick? You wanna
Well,
weigh in?
what happens to individuals and what happens to institutions, it's devastating to both. I mean, when we had our experience, the season was canceled, 12 games left in a Division I hockey program. I don't want to tell you how much that cost. But so it's devastating to the institution, not so much from a financial or number of games lost or anything like that, but the stigma that you're involved in something like that and you couldn't stop it, even when you tried to. And what happens to the individual? They're all scarred. Some leave as soon as it's over and they get out of the school so nobody can talk to them about it or what have you. There's nothing positive that happens from one of these experiences. And it's our duty as administrators to teach our coaches to be able to speak to their athletes, to their students about it prior to anything happening. If you're not proactive, you're part of the problem. You need to put your arm around all the newcomers and the new students and say, this is the future of our program. Let's treat them with respect. And if anybody does differently, we've got a problem. And playing on our team, just as Heather said, is a privilege. It's not a right, and you will no longer be allowed to play. Students have to hear that from someone of authority. When I speak at colleges and universities, I usually end the program by handing out a T-shirt, and sometimes it says team, and that means together each athlete matters. And on the back of it, it says courage. We have to teach our students how to deal with these things before it even happens. Give them a lifeline, someone they can go to, someone they can talk to. But I will tell you this, it's so embarrassing. Why does it happen? Dave just asked, why does it happen? It's embarrassing, it's humiliating. They don't want to talk about it anymore. That's why it continues to happen. So until someone has the courage and the venue for speaking up about it, and then it'll continue to happen. We need to have a program ahead of time that addresses the issues and teaches our students how to get out of it, how to deal with it before it's a problem.
And the consequences are deadly in some cases. In Milton, Vermont, there's a case where a young man was hazed, and part of the hazing ended up he was sodomized. And someone took a broomstick and shoved it inside of him. And that young man took his own life, committed suicide. That's this end of the spectrum. That's pretty horrific for everyone involved. What made anyone think that was okay to do? And again, it goes back to the question about why is so much of this sexualized? And yet it is. And, you know, and the question is, particularly on men's teams, you know, when guys have to strip down and go through their hazing in their boxer shorts or in a thong they borrowed from a female friend, you know, is that homoerotic? Or is it like rape, about power and control? And that's a question as society we have to answer. Because we know that rape is about power and control. So much of hazing is also about power and control.
That's a good lead-in to my next question, which is about preventative measures. Rick, why don't you get us started? Do you have some specific preventative measures that you talk about when you consult on this subject?
Well, there's a lot of different things you can do, and you almost have to do all of them. The first is the understanding that education is the key. Getting your students to talk about it and get them to accept the concepts that you're dealing with, whether it's definitions or it's consequences or whatever. Students have to feel, at least on the college level, that they have some ownership, some participation in what they're talking about, so that they buy into it. If they don't buy into it, you can give them all the education you want in the world. But getting coaches to be non-naive so that they understand that it could happen, and the leadership of your student leaders, your captains, or whatever, whoever are part of your program. And that's what we found out. You know, I tell somebody, we had a statement that there would be zero tolerance for any activity involving hazing. So then the thing happens and it blows up. So a reporter says to me, well, what's your zero tolerance policy? And I said, you know what? I don't have a clue. I have no idea what zero tolerance means. It's just a statement that we're not going to tolerate it. So then we started to get into it a little more and learn so much. And what we did to prevent it, if I could just maybe throw that slide up there. We started a 5-point program on our campus. And basically it was this. At the insistence of a president, we devised a contract for our students that would meet with a hazing educator, and it would define things, it would spell out consequences, and it would just go through the whole gamut of what it was, and that they signed it so they know what the consequences were. It could be expulsion from the team or whatever it happened to be. And then we established a captain's organization that we could meet regularly with our student leaders, once a month, twice a month. And the only way you get them there is bring a couple of pizzas and a case of soda or what have you, and on a Sunday evening where they got to buy their own meal. But you could talk about these issues, and on a regular basis. And then we mandated a preseason community service project to help them try to bond together, whatever it was. And then we developed a PowerPoint program, and this is what we went through. I alluded to this a little earlier: hazing in athletics, the misunderstandings, the truths and values. And I don't know which goes forward, but you know, hazing could happen. I'm not going to run through this, and it does happen. That's our program. January 12th, sellout crowd, nobody's there because the season was canceled. But this is one of my favorite slides. Hazing incidents like a lightning bolt and synonymous. It destroys. It's indiscriminate. You don't know when it's going to happen. It just comes out of the blue sometimes. And there's nothing positive that happens from it. It tears apart. So we go through this whole thing, and the national study, there's some statistics you've seen, and all these different kinds of things. And we go through it, and we throw up a slide, and we talk about, what does this mean to you? Here's a slide. What does this say to you? And get the students to talk with us. That's, I think, the most important thing that we do. I say we do. I've been retired for 10 years now, but they do, and they do a good job of it. And I know they continually work at it. And then the 5th point that we had on our program was that we asked our students, because it was so negative in the community, asked what happens to an institution. My wife canceled the newspaper because every day she was tired of looking at it with a signal of our logo with a round circle with a line through it. She said, I'm not going to look at that every morning. I'm tired of it. So she canceled the newspaper. And I said, hon, you know, I mean, don't take it like that. But that's what the community looks at you like. I couldn't go into a grocery store wearing a jacket that said University of Vermont Athletics. Because they'd say, oh, are you part of the program? Mm-hmm. Yes, I am. Oh, I feel so bad for you. I said, don't feel bad for me. I got a great job. We have a lot of good students. They made some stupid decisions. But my job is to educate them and get them through this process, and so that they learn to become effective citizens. And we're going to change some things with them. We're going to change their attitudes. their behaviors, their skills, their knowledge, just like the math professor, and if we're lucky, their values. And to change a value, it takes a significant emotional experience, and that certainly was. So we put our students through the discussion of this slide presentation, and then the last thing we ask them to do is to get out into the community and become ambassadors. Go to the second grade classroom and read to students. Do whatever it takes. Go to a senior citizen center and serve dinner. And let people know you're part of our program. So they don't have this one view that we're a bunch of idiots on the hill. We got good students, good athletes, and good people. But good people sometimes make poor decisions. So education is the key. That's what we've done. And that, you know what? And I'm not smart enough or foolish enough to think that this solves all the problems. I'm not the Lone Ranger. I don't have any silver bullets. You guys probably don't even know who the Lone Ranger is, but that's all right.
I know who it is.
He said the silver bullet will explain everything. He was a good guy, but he wore a mask. But I don't have all the answers. But I don't want to be negligent in not trying to do something about it. And that's my program.
Heather, you want to weigh in on that topic, and then Dave? Any preventive measures that you've come across that you think are particularly useful?
Well, it's the one area that I get the most questions about when I'm doing my presentations, and that I often feel the most ill-equipped to answer, because I think that there is a dearth of resources for, programs, presentations, things that can be brought into the middle school and the high school level. So in that gap, as a lawyer, not an educator, I often do a lot of trainings. Last week I did 2 trainings, and the week before I did 4 trainings, and every August, November, and March I do trainings for coaches all around the state and athletic directors on these topics. And what I try to impress upon them is the need for education and working with their teams more than just the one-off. And they are eager and wanting more resources. And when I talk to them about explaining that engaging these behaviors is a violation of the values of the team, and at the same time, students often have a hard time perceiving that to be the case, perhaps the root is some perspective shifting questions, like, how would I feel if what I'm about to do was videotaped and then shown on the web? How would I feel if the principal walked by? Am I being asked to do something illegal? How would I feel if my parents walked in? If in any of those you wince, this is your hint that what you are doing is likely hazing. And so trying to find different ways to reach students, but I agree that the most powerful way is to have students working with the material themselves. Having them focus on maybe having them do some role playing about what do you think a hazing scenario might look like. Having them think that through, act it out, and talk about it together, while not shifting the burden that we own the responsibility for responding to these things, but getting them to engage and be involved is key. And again, I believe that the more we can align the values of the organization and the educational institution with not engaging in this, and the more we make that a fused reality, the better off that we will be.
And the three of us battle against hazing all the time, professionally, personally. But one of the things we forget about is that what the audience sees happens all the time. So how many of you are Red Sox fans? Anybody Red Sox fans? Sure. Okay. Even if you hate the Red Sox. So I was watching a Red Sox game one night, and Don Orsillo and Jerry Remy were making fun of the hazing that had just taken place with Daisuke Matsuzaka, who was the star pitcher who made millions and millions of dollars from Japan. And he was a rookie. And after the game, and the team was leaving from Logan Field and going to another game, he goes to his locker, all of his clothes were gone. The only thing that was there was a dress. And he had to put on a dress and travel with the team on the team bus to Logan Airport, and then fly to the next destination dressed in a woman's clothes. We'll get to that in just a second. A baseball rookie was on a team bus heading for another airport. He was dressed in a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader's outfit. because when he got through the game that day, he goes to his locker, his street clothes were gone. The only thing that left was a Dallas Cowboys cheerleader outfit, which included the high-top boots, the high-top leather boots, so that when a rifle shot came into the bus as it's traveling to the airport, the bullet hits his leg, but because he was wearing the leather boots, he was okay because it deflected the bullet. They're talking about this on the air. If you want to talk about the military, go and look up blood pinning. Go online, look up YouTube, wherever you want to go, Google blood pinning. The military said, we have no idea what this is all about. So when you finish, you know, these are elite servicemen and women, mostly men, and they get a thing that they get to wear in their uniform that's got that sharp stick behind it. And part of what they do is that they have them dressed down in their boxers, and then they drive that pin into their shoulder until they're bleeding. And the military says, we don't know anything about this. Well, Clint Eastwood had a movie, and part of the movie was blood pinning. So how are we able to stop high school, middle school, college students from hazing when they see this all the time? So I wrote an email to Jerry Remy and Don Orsillo, and I said, please stop talking about this. Because what you do is, you have a platform. I have no platform. You have a platform. And you talk about this on air, and kids are like, man, I want to do that. That's awesome. Now let's talk about the fact that they made these men dress up like women, because the most humiliating thing you can do to a man is make him, quote, be like a woman. You want to talk about misogyny? That's it right there. What kind of response do you think I got from the Red Sox? Zero. Nothing. They don't do it as much anymore, but when you've got Major League Baseball players and the announcers not only talking about it, but laughing hysterically about, isn't this funny what they did to Daisuke Matsusaka? No, it's not. It was humiliating, it was degrading, and here are these two commentators making fun of hazing, and what does that do for anyone who's watching? It not only normalizes it, and it makes it okay, but those young kids who are watching the baseball go, I want to be part of that. That's pretty devastating.
We're running a little bit short of time, and I want to make sure that Heather gets to talk about some of the legal aspects of this. But there's a question that precedes that, and I hope you can provide some fairly short answers. We've been talking just now about preventive measures. I'm wondering, starting with you, Rick, if you don't have the preventive measures or they haven't worked, you have a hazing incident, institution has to respond. Have you identified some particularly good ways of responding over the years, or?
I'm not sure I can identify anything good, but there are a number of different things you can do. Just standing by the principle that participation is a privilege, not a right. And so you can take away those privileges depending on how bad it is. You can suspend someone for participation for a week. You can suspend them from 1 or 2 games. I've done that before. You're suspended for 3 games. You can't go to practice. You can't do anything. That puts them behind the 8 ball. So there are a number of things you can do. But what you do, what I think is most important is to spell out some of these consequences with the student leaders before they happen. And they'll come up with some pretty good ideas. And that's what you follow. You put them in writing. You let everybody see them. It's not good enough to keep them here. It's got to be black and white in front of individuals. You do this, this could happen.
Dave or Heather?
I just think that that's clarity of message and certainty of an outcome should you nevertheless engage in these behaviors. That goes a long way. You have to take away the guesswork. You have to take away the idea in kids' minds, well, maybe it's accepted, maybe it's okay, maybe it's not that big of a deal. And in the absence of getting in front of that, you're going to see it happening, or at least happening in the shadows.
Now, this is a law school, so you've probably been wondering when we're going to talk about the legal aspects of this, and the answer is now. Heather, can you give us a quick summary of Vermont law on hazing and tell us whether you think there's a need for any particular changes in that law as we move forward?
A quick summary of
I'm sorry.
law. Given that I presented on this also last week for 3.5 hours, I'll try to do it in 2 minutes.
You have more than that. You can take 5.
The law, as I started at the beginning of this session, is actually broken into those 3 categories of these, what I call student-on-student behaviors, inappropriate student-on-student conduct, which can fall into the categories of hazing, harassment, and bullying. The laws that were passed in 1999, 2000, and 2004 with the bullying law were all designed under the Vermont statutes to target behaviors in schools, places of public accommodation, that have at their core either behaviors that are targeting students on the basis of some protected category, which the law has already recognized as protected: race, gender, creed, color, national origin, gender identity, sexual identity, marriage, any of those things, with certain outcomes if I'm engaging in the behavior and the student who's on the receiving end of that has difficulty accessing school. That is harassment. Or dangerous or demeaning behavior, which is either bullying or hazing. By identifying those, we didn't then wave a magic wand and say, okay, now these won't happen anymore. We then married with those definitions a very strict rubric of procedures for K-12 schools in Vermont, where when on notice of any suspicion that we reasonably believe those behaviors are occurring, we have to initiate an investigation within 24 hours and finish it within 5 days. And I spend a lot of time training folks all over the state on how to conduct those investigations. The reason for the investigation is to make sure that we don't simply just react, but that we take a very deep dive and understand how long has it been going on? How has it been impacting the targeted student? What is the background of the student who's engaging in it, so that then we can target remedial measures that are designed to prevent a reoccurrence and to support the targeted student so that they can continue to access their education. That is the charge that the Vermont legislature has given to Vermont schools. It's now been in place for over a decade, and I still am doing a lot of work helping schools get their arms around that. What I spend most of my time on is helping them understand the trigger for an investigation and fulfilling an investigation in a way as thorough and accurate as possible, where they are making good data-driven decisions, understanding the full scope of the problem. Parents often on their heels when they get the notification letters telling them an investigation's going on, and they say, why is my kid being investigated? And we have to work with them and explain, this is so we can assess what's going on. The goal is to make sure students are safe and can access schools. Those are the twin components. And in the absence of a good, thorough investigation, arguably leaving it to the discretion of an administrator based on, well, I know Joey for a couple of years, and I think this is what's going on. No, 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 no. We're going to talk to the students, talk to the teachers, look at their grades, find out what's going on, and make decisions based on that. That's a big task for schools. No one in the school has this as their only job. Most administrators have about 4 or 5 different areas of responsibility. And so it is a heavy lift, and it takes time to get up to speed, and every year you almost have to sort of revisit it. But I do see progress, and I think that it is a nice shift away from just on-the-fly decisions to, as I said, data-driven decisions. The law requires that that be done, and in the absence of that, there is liability for schools. There's liability for schools if they're aware of a problem and they choose not to respond in this way. Or even after the end of the investigation, they don't take what we call reasonable steps to address it. Schools are also charged with prevention through education, but in fact, the liability, as long as you have the policy in place and you are engaging in education, the liability truly attaches for those things that we're aware of, and then we choose not to respond, or we respond in a way that's unreasonable.
I think this is a perfect time for you to ask some questions. We have about 9 minutes or so plenty of time for some questions. And we have 2 gentlemen with microphones who are happy to amplify your voice.
Hello. First, I'd like to thank the members of the panel for coming to our school and addressing an issue that is very important. I'd like also to thank Dr. Porto for holding this event every year. There's a demand, especially from those of us with some interest in sports here, especially given the fact that not often do we address these sensitive issues. And if I may, I'd like to ask the legal representative on the panel. You mentioned some reasonable steps. What are required legally as reasonable steps from institutions if investigations, I believe, bring up some sort of issues? Would you address that more?
Sure.
Thank you.
What I was referring to is, so say we investigate a particular student for having engaged in harassing conduct towards another student. We're required to take what we call reasonable steps to prevent a reoccurrence. That's straight out of the statute. And so the question then is for the school, and I always say this is when you can put your educator hat back on, but informed by information obtained through a pretty legalistic investigation, which is knowing what you know about the student. What do you think you need to do in relationship to the student who offended, who engaged in the behavior, to prevent them from engaging in it again? And so it's usually one of two things, or combined: some level of discipline, where the institution stands behind its rules and says, you were noticed in advance, you should not engage in this, you chose to, therefore you're going to serve a certain amount of days suspension. Now, suspension isn't what it was when I was young. A lot of kids who spend a day at home are simply Xboxing, and they consider that, you know, bank error in their favor. So a suspension is still seen by the outside world as sort of the gold standard of standing behind your rules, but by and large, we tend to prefer in-school suspension or some other kind of measure. In addition to the suspension side, then there is the, well, what is the education behind this? We would like to get at, why were you engaging in this? Is there some part about this behavior you don't understand? Believe it or not, a lot of students are engaging in a lot of racial and other national origin, religious animus behaviors in the last 2 years that I hadn't seen come across my desk. I'm sure you're really surprised and shocked to hear that. They are mimicking a lot of what they're seeing in the national discourse coming across the airwaves, and some kids truly don't understand the history and background to some of the terms that they are throwing around. So reasonable steps can also include educating students or having them engage in some level of social contract or remediation towards the victim. Now, we do that with some caution because sometimes the victim doesn't want to hear from the perpetrator again. And so, you know, the letter of apology and all that, you know, in some ways can have limited effect. But perhaps, you know, a book report on, you know, the Diary of Anne Frank and a couple of other things, if you were scrawling a swastika on a notebook of a Jewish student and not really understanding what you were doing about that. So those are the kinds of things that we think about. And then broadly, hey, do we think that maybe this entire class in general could use a refresher on this? Let's not consider this just isolated. It happened as part of this class. Maybe we need to address these issues. So we try to get at it from all angles. The more, the better. The more layered the response, the better. I hope I answered your question. Great.
Do you have a couple of slides you wanted to put up? We still have a little time.
I think we blew past that, so I'm fine. It's really
all right. I'm sorry. Another question.
Hi, I also want to thank you for coming here and teaching us about what's going on with hazing. I'm curious about whether students know that that there are legal remedies that they can take, considering that some of the more serious hazing offenses could have some like personal injury claims to them. Whether that's viable, considering they're so young, whether that's something that, you know, in terms of preventing it, whether it's something that they can be encouraged to do, and whether schools would be maybe less enthusiastic about doing it, considering that they might be held liable, like what, in terms of the environment for encouraging possible legal remedies.
I don't think they even think about it until something awful happens.
I can just say from the K through 12 perspective, if there is an investigation launched under any of those definitions, and we do the same kind of investigation and we don't prejudge whether or not it is hazing, harassment, or bullying at the inception, we just know it's inappropriate student conduct that might fall into one of those categories. We don't narrow the scope. We let the facts drive scope. But at the end of those investigations, student families, because most of these students are minors, the parents will receive a letter announcing the outcome, not the details, because you have minors involved. So we won't say, hey, your student Susie was the victim of behaviors from Johnny, and let me tell you everything I learned about Johnny. Can't do that. There's a federal law prohibiting that. But they will get a letter that says, we've looked at the behavior, and we've determined whether or not our policy was violated. And then number two, they get mandatory notification in that letter of their rights of appeal internally to Vermont AOE, to the Human Rights Commission, to the Office for Civil Rights down in Boston, and there are attachments with the addresses for those places. So we have to affirmatively encourage and inform them of that information.
Hello, thank you for a very holistic, multidisciplinary view of the problem. I have a quick comment and two questions, one legal and one not legal. Coming here from Thailand, I really appreciate your emphasis that hazing is not limited to sports, that it's pervasive in all different institutions, because coming here from Thailand, I know that hazing even in temples isn't a big problem. It's underground, like many hazing issues, but temple abbots will pass on what they experienced as young monks. One legal question is, has there been any case where somebody who engaged in hazing or an institution that turned a blind eye to hazing escaped liability, and what was their strongest defense? And then a non-legal question is, to the extent that unity is so important in sports, how do you, have you had programs where older athletes, upperclassmen come and participate in the training to discourage people from hazing, and how does that affect the atmosphere in terms of team unity?
You want to divide up those two questions? Or?
You guys want to start on the last one?
Yeah, I can. Well, you're absolutely right. Unity in the sports team is important, or the band, or whatever it is, the drama team. And what you need to do as a coach, as an administrator, you need to plan activities that will do that. Like invite the team for a picnic and make the seniors wait on the newcomers, or whatever. Have some relay races and give the winners popsicles after practice, or things that bring them together. Simple things. I can remember telling people about traditions that have meaning. And when you put the team through traditions, for example, like awarding your number when you're a freshman, a first-year player, and you don't have a uniform until the night before the first game. You have no idea what your number's going to be. And a coach has a ceremony, and he hands it out, and he says, Rick Farnum, you'll wear number 71 for the next 4 years. Enjoy it. Good luck, cat 'em out. In front, and then the upperclassmen shake your hand, say, welcome. You know, those kind of traditions that help you feel that you're part of the whole picture. And you got to be creative to do those kinds of things. You can have you can pair a senior with a new player, big brother, big sister type program. There's a lot of different things you can do.
And just sadly, I don't think there's enough conversation about this. I met last weekend with our SAC, which is a Student Athletic Advisory Committee, which is made up of 2 athletes from all of our 21 teams. And I was coming down here, and I said, how many of you talk about hazing in your social contract? Everyone raised their hand. I said, how many of you discuss this the first day with the team? Everybody raised their hand. I said, how many of you talk about it during the season, about the fact that hazing can go on? 6 students raised their hand. They're not talking about it. And so we're not bringing alums back to talk about it because it's a secret. And what happens with the hazing is that I now have information that's secret, and nobody else around here knows that. And so it's a private thing, and that's one of the reasons I want to belong. And by belonging, that means I keep my mouth shut.
Heather, can you answer the legal question, and then we need to wrap up?
Sure. Hazing is a crime in Vermont, and so there is a criminal statute. And I will say that in the cases that I've been aware of, by and large, the students who were involved in those criminal acts did have involvement. The details of that, however, in our justice system are all confidential, 18 and under. So they're kept under seal, and so it's not widely known, not widely discussed. But there is a recourse within the criminal justice system for that as well. Yeah.
We identify that in our student handbooks, that in Vermont, hazing is against the law. There are legal sanctions, and you can read the statutes and figure them out yourself, but we let them know that it's illegal.
And the only thing I'll add to that is that, you know, here's the NCAA thing from 2007. This came out in 2014, 123 pages. There's 1 page about hazing. And so we have a lot of things. If you go on ncaa.org, you'll see a lot of information about hazing. It's all sitting on a shelf someplace. It's not being looked at, and it's not being talked about, and that's what has to change. And if we haven't come out with anything from the NCAA since this, it's a good document. Rick was a big part of it. Since 2007, 2008, this is 2018. They're going to come out with something in the spring of 2018 to talk about hazing. It's about damn well time.
Thank you to the panelists, and thank you to everybody who helped. Much appreciated. How about we give these folks a nice round of applause?
They didn't call me to help with it.
Thanks a lot for coming.
They didn't call me to help with a new one.